Hi, everyone. It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we haven't talked about in quite a while, and it's one that we ourselves are not very familiar with. And today's guest, Sherri Heller, is she kind of bridges a couple of positions or roles, I'll say. And so she's got a very unique experience in knowing a lot about this topic. She's an interfaith minister, did you say, Sherri? Yeah,
Yes.
and also a trauma-informed therapist. And so before she even introduces herself, I thought maybe, Sherri, you could define what is spiritual or religious abuse. I mean, we hear about narcissism and
Mhm.
other kinds of abuse, but we don't talk about this very much. What does it mean?
Yeah. It's basically a form of psychological abuse. So it employs a lot of the typical tactics and behaviors that narcissistic abuse involves. Gaslighting, of course, it's more of a kind of ontological gaslighting, smear campaigns, intimidation, isolation. It runs the gamut, but it uses moral framework, scripture, doctrine, religious community as a way to sanctify the abuse. It creates even greater cognitive dissonance because it seems as if it is kind of uh, divinely righteous.
Yeah, you
You
said the
know?
term divinely sanctioned. That sounds fascinating.
Yes, yes. I mean, and that is reinforced by, of course, by a community, unless it is in a family system. But there are always flying monkeys. But then the whole family system is employed to defend the ideology of the messianic narcissist who's at the helm,
Mm-hmm.
who is the arbiter of truth. So that is essentially the role they want to occupy. And they become the conduit to divinity.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting how you think, how does this happen? But we will get into that. So before we start, Sherri, can you formally introduce yourself and tell us a little more about your background?
Sure. As you already introduced me, my name is Sherri. I studied world religions and was ordained as an interfaith minister. That was just an organic trajectory of my own path of self-realization as a trauma survivor. Also grew up in systemic abuse that involved generational mental illness, inclusive of narcissistic personality disorder. And as I, began to heal, I really started looking beyond the self to the transpersonal, which I think is sort of just an organic process that occurs. I do a lot of writing. I write on narcissistic abuse, complex trauma recovery, and sometimes about the macro levels that we see on a cultural level, political level. Um, that's where I am professionally, and I love the arts, so I like to include art in my work. But my this is sort of a life mission for me, given my background.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad that we have you here because you sound like one of ours. Like,
Oh,
been
wonderful.
there, got out, doing
Yeah.
things with it now.
Hmm.
So I think because many people don't understand what religious or spiritual abuse is, we have certain ideas of what we think it is. And I think for
Hmm.
me, off the top of my head, when I imagine religious abuse, I see an Amish community and someone being ostracized or thrown out. But in
Hmm.
I think more modern and common communities, it's not like that. Can you get into some of the misconceptions that people might have about this topic?
Hmm. Sure. I mean, the ostracism is definitely a part of it, and that is what creates the existential dread. The idea that if you deviate in any way, you will be exiled from the community, but not just from the community, or from meaning itself, because spiritual abuse is really about co-opting meaning.
Mm,
And even what's called epistemic trust, your ability to trust your own perceptions and your own inherent sense of morality. So, and we could see it in cancel culture. We could see it in other arenas. We could see it in activism. Um, it's it can become very concealed because it is kind of like a glorified and amplified form of virtue signaling, in which the ideology is really seen as this path to enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think while it gets losing my language here, why it gets obscured is because it is um, the insidious aspect, which is to control, to use coercive control to dominate others, is cloaked in virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, I think, an inherent sense for people who are targeted by these communities to want to be delivered from their own loneliness, from their own sense of isolation, or their own asperities in life, to find a community. And so every form of psychological abuse starts with love bombing. So the community itself, the person at the helm, whether it's a guru, a pastor, a teacher, this can also be found in a lot of professional circles, teaching circles,
Mm-hmm.
present themselves as creating a space where others will have a sense of belonging, which is what we want from spirituality. We want to feel connected, right? We attach to the abstract. The breakdown is systemic, and as with narcissistic abuse. So it happens over time. So by the time the person is feeling safe, that's when the backlash occurs. That's when one is blindsided. When any form of questioning is seen as moral depravity, the person will be humiliated by the congregation or within the family in the sense of prosocial camouflage, where altruism, activism, philanthropy is lauded, while there are abusive dynamics that occur behind the scenes. Any questioning then is going to be conceptualized as uh, sinful in some way.
Yeah.
So I really want to emphasize that it is something that is very systemic and calculated, as with narcissistic abuse, So the idea is to pull the person in to allow them to feel safe so that they are attached. And they're not just attached in the sense to others, but to ideology. And they're attached to an idea of a spiritual dimension or to God. And that's what makes it all the more insidious.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts because there's somebody that I care about very much who has gotten involved in a very extreme spiritual community. And when I tried to talk, I try to talk to her about like what happens in situations where there is domestic violence in this community. And the person said, well, that divorce is not acceptable.
Right. Yeah. And that is intentional, of course, because the more that disciples can be dominated and controlled, the better for the leader, whoever the leader is, whether it's a guru, whether it is a pastor. There is a intent to dehumanize, and that's always the intention with psychological abuse, which is to break the person down. So for there to be any volition or there any even an idea of what constitutes abuse, that's a threat. Because it sheds light on what is wrong with the system, right? So you want to eliminate that threat. And of course, you have to scapegoat and marginalize, ostracize the one who starts to posit any questions at all. I worked years ago with a woman who, I'm not going to name the organization, she was involved in a pretty well-known religious organization. The congregation she was involved with was particularly rigid and narcissistically driven. And she knew that she was being humiliated and that she had to get out, but she felt pathologically attached. She actually was, her parents were in prison as a child. She was very disenfranchised. And this became a community, a place that seemed to be her salvation. And she was naturally a musician. She played violin, which was, she didn't have that in her family. And she was an African American woman. And she really, this was sort of her ticket out of the situation she was in. And she was given a full scholarship, actually, to tour on a national level. And she was robbed of that by this community. She was not allowed to play music. She could not embark on that venture. It was really heartbreaking and nefarious, and yet she struggled, even though it seemed so blatantly clear that the intentionality was malevolent. She, at that point, as she was an adult, when I started working with her, she felt she just could not leave because of the existential dread.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of so many things also with this particular community where a pastor decides who's going to get married. It's
Yeah.
not the individual, the pastor decides, and that there are rules. There's no dancing and singing, and you can't go to movies, and you can't go to concerts, and you can't interact with the outside world. There's a belief that college is like education is a bad thing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. Because any thought system that will amplify your consciousness is a threat. So it could be any deviation from ideology, whether it's religion. All other religions are suspect and are depraved, sinful. That's inclusive of certain kinds of literature, intellectual pursuits, even political exploration. So, yeah, the idea is to have a very tightly knit, rigid, constricted system in which there is no outside influence. And then, of course, the outside world is damnation and apocalyptic, which makes it all the more frightening for a person who feels conflicted. They want to get out. One guy I'm working with, he was in a cult, also within a pretty well known religious organization, and he almost died from an ulcer as a teenager, because there is an inherent awareness of um, what feels dangerous. We are at the core animals. We have an instinctual, awareness of danger that becomes muted when we're traumatized. And so his, I think, fundamental sense of self-preservation was clashing with the indoctrination and the fear, what will happen if I defy the system?
Yeah.
And so somatically, that was really destructive.
Yeah. So we've been talking about like large level, like these communities, but you mentioned family systems. So let's narrow it down now, because our audience are people who are dealing with those larger communities. But often the example that you mentioned too was in a family where one person is almost like the channel, the conduit to divinity.
Yes.
Let's say someone is in a marriage where that's taking place. Are there certain, because we know how the nature of coercive control works. Like you said, there's the love bombing, and then it's a slow, insidious thing that you wake up one day and you're like, how did this even happen? And 1 in 2 people in relationships don't even know that it's abusive.
Yes.
So much is familiar, and it's happened slowly over time. But let's say that someone feels that that cognitive dissonance where their brain or their body is saying something's wrong, but they can't pinpoint what maybe the red flags are. So for someone who maybe is in a system like that, a family, are there certain things that they should be like, let me think about that. Like I should question that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, anyone who declares that they are a bastion of absolute truth should be questioned. Where there is an absence of humility, you always have to, question that person's intention.
Mm.
and where they're coming from. Because to me, humility is a basic spiritual principle. We're fallible as human beings. So people who are ego-driven, egomaniacal, messianic, they may present as being very charismatic and have like a strong sense of confidence. But I think what's important to ultimately consider is, are they operating from a place of kindness, or are they saying things in terms of that they have transcended all things, they are enlightened, that they are beyond fallibility, that they have a special knowledge of how to elevate oneself, to raise one's vibration, to to uh, or even belittling our basic human limitations. I think is a big red flag. The idea that that is something that is uh, shows demonstrative inferiority, that one has not really cultivated their spirituality to be beyond our human condition, is lunacy.
Hmm.
But yet it seems very appealing because life is hard and life is not fair. And we want to believe somehow that we can be greater than these forces that we have to contend with in life. So that's what a lot of people are seduced by, the idea that this person will deliver you, and
Hmm.
even in the form of a mate. But particularly for children, children are very vulnerable to that kind of indoctrination because they already imbue the parent with godlike attributes.
Hmm.
They need to developmentally, and then of course will gradually go through individuation and see that we are fallible, that disappointment is a part of the human condition, a part of life, but the narcissist will not permit that because the narcissist must be worshipped.
Yeah. I mean, you probably saw me smiling several
Mm,
times. I'm just thinking
mm,
about the past and certain things with making someone else an authority, not
yeah.
always even necessarily in a spiritual way, but
Mm,
how we enter into relationships and people convince us that they are maybe smarter than us and more elevated and know more for whatever reason.
hmm.
So yeah, hindsight's 2020. I wish I had noticed that sooner.
Me
So you
too.
mentioned some of the things that I think are also more overt. We also notice that with narcissism, people are covert and it's more hidden. Is what you mentioned, is it different from someone that's more hidden, where someone can approach it
Yeah, I
very
think
quickly or indirectly or passively?
I think it tends to be more subtle. I think it's the same kind of behaviors and the same kind of tactical and strategic operating. With the gaslighting, will tend to be more ontological. It might not be as direct as "you never said that," but more so that, well, you might have said that, and God really disapproved of that,
Mhm.
or you may believe you said that, but I think that might be some satanic influence that's making you believe that. So it becomes draped in this kind of spiritual language, a religious language.
It's almost like
Um,
triangulation, like me and God both feel this way.
that's a great way of looking at it. Yes, yes, that's very true. Yes, some kind of higher dimension is involved in the relationship and informing the conduit, like Christ, of what is the true way, what is absolute. Um, I think with prosocial camouflage, it is very cloaked and occurs more so in these kinds of families that seem very evolved, very progressive, very steeped in activism. And I've worked with some people who have grown up in such families, and they have a very insidious form um, of cognitive dissonance that actually translates into somatic symptoms because they can't reconcile with what things look like and what they saw behind the scenes with the kind of the screaming that would occur, the antagonism, the mind control. Often there's a lot of uh, one thing that can be seen is really great parenting, which is particularly insidious in these families, is this idea that the child has to occupy a space where they are uh, driven by philanthropy. You know, it's like they're indoctrinated early on to be like these martyrs, these virtuous figures who go off into the world to save everyone.
Can you give us some examples of like what this might look
Mhm.
like?
It could look like grooming a child to want to go to Nepal to feed, orphans, or to follow some kind of missionary path.
That's
Or
exactly what I'm thinking in my head is like children are like, oh, I'm going on this mission and I'm going to help all these people and I'm really good.
right, except that they're not allowed to be children. So
Right.
one young woman I'm working with, I mean, she would find herself in profound states of dissociation.
Hmm.
That's how, because she was never seen. So the complex trauma is very severe because the child is shaped to be a conduit of goodness on this very elevated scale as a purveyor of God's will. When what they need, they require that, developmental needs to be met. There are milestones involved here: basic trust, oppositional bonding, peer relationships, attachment. And so the attachment is completely corrupted by the
Yes,
offense.
as you're saying that, I'm thinking from what I've seen, um, is just obedience.
Yes, yes, obedience, and yet it seems like the irony with that is that they also are so neglected, especially in pro-social circles where there's a lot of a kind of presentation of communal living, uh, ecology, everybody being invited into the house,
Yes.
while the children are severely neglected and um, are really instructed to conform to this, so they have to obey. But it doesn't look like they are forced into obedience because at the same time they're prodded. Go explore yourself creatively. Go figure this out somehow on your own as a child,
Hmm.
and be a good narcissistic extension for us.
Hmm.
Essentially, be supply, but under the guise of look how many opportunities we're giving them. So it looks like beneficence.
Hmm.
And that's why it's so important to look behind the behavior into the intentionality of the abuser to really see, well, what is this about? Is this actually for the child? The child doesn't necessarily want to be responsible for world hunger. The child wants to be able to feel safe and to explore and discover and cultivate pure relationships.
And also not agree with everything their parents said. Like you talked about
Right.
oppositional attachment. I didn't know that term, but I'm thinking, developmentally, especially as teenagers, I remember myself, there's a lot of
Yeah.
friction. Like you're kind of supposed to fight with your parents as part of the individuation process. Like, I'm
Yes.
not you, I'm not the same.
Right.
Like
Right.
I
And
got
the
to carve out
first
my own identity.
Absolutely. And the first stage of that is in toddlerhood, the first stage of individuation that gets recapitulated in adolescence.
Hmm.
So, which makes it so difficult because the whole premise of individuation is I want to be able to be authentically who I am, embody the truth of who I am, but also know that I won't be abandoned,
Hmm.
that I will remain securely attached. So that's impossible when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent, a narcissistic spiritual leader, or a parent who employs spirituality or religion to really kind of concretize the control.
Yeah. oh my gosh, this is so provocative and so much to
Mm.
think about. Like we could talk for hours about it. So let me think about now a family that's divorcing, where let's say there is like a religion that they both followed, and one party decides this isn't working for me, and maybe I'm going to explore something different. What do you notice in that kind of family system with what the other parent and community do, and possibly how they enlist a child to almost ostracize that parent?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're going to see parental alienation employed. Um, it's unfortunate because the family court system is not sophisticated and does not see through the veneer of the smear campaign that is occurring. Often they side with the abuser, and I've seen this in the worst situations. So, what one can anticipate, and I know this sounds kind of contraindicated, but I often suggest to my clients that they have to learn how to play the game. You can't be a shark in these situations. You have to know what the terrain is, and use guile, which often actually, ironically, feels morally difficult for a lot of people
Hmm.
because they feel they're not being truthful. But you have to learn how to mitigate the damage because the court system is going to push for reconciliation at any cost. They don't typically recognize abuse, particularly narcissistic abuse, and even when there's sexual abuse involved, more insidious forms of abuse, it's not recognized, it's not addressed. So one can anticipate that the narcissist is going to try to employ the community, of course, to disparage, to assassinate the character,
Hmm.
of the victims in the family. The children will be, of course, um, will be corrupted by the indoctrination. They will be in the guise of spiritual truth telling. The children will be informed that their other parent is misguided, and it'll be presented as if it is a compassionate concern, for the parent who is deviating from the path. Very likely the court system buys into this. And so I would say for the person who is dealing with the situation is you have to pretend to be complicit in some way. You have to work behind the scenes and present as if you are in tacit agreement, and because and this is something my clients often come to as they realize this is bigger than them. When you're dealing with narcissistic abuse and you're dealing with this kind of pathology, you're dealing with people who don't have a moral compass. They don't have empathy. That makes them ruthless. You don't know what they will pull out of their hats because they don't care. They don't have any conscience. So you have to really consider how also to be somewhat duplicitous and tactical. And that's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, Chris and I, like I told you, we work with people dealing with the worst situations, and tactical is a word that we use all the time. I'm thinking still about the stuff with the children. I think one of our clients said that one of her children came up to her and said that the other parent said that she should be talking to good Christians and not just bad divorced people.
Mhm. Sure.
And she didn't
Yeah.
know what to say. So we know that kids often use what's called borrowed scenarios, where they just parrot what the other parent says. It doesn't match their own voice or their development. And parents often don't know what to say when a child is like that. It's abused by proxy. The child is the vessel.
Yes.
So any recommendations on, let's say I am divorcing, I'm leaving the religious community and the family, and my child is telling me that I'm morally depraved on some
Yeah,
level.
I would try to find a middle ground.
Hmm.
I would say, yes, marriage is a sacrament. It is recognized as a sacrament. I think there are small seeds that can be planted within our human fallibility. And of course, if it's a fall redemption theology, which theistic, Semitic traditions are, the dualistic traditions are, but it's magnified and warped exponentially by the narcissist, you try to align with some degree of truth
Mm-hmm.
that is being perverted by the narcissist so that you can kind of have a conduit in. We are fallible and therefore we can't measure up to ideals. We could only try to exemplify them,
Mm.
and that really, especially in Christian based traditions, Christ's message is one of forgiveness. So trying to forgive those who have deviated from that idea of perfection, I think you have to work with it. And I think that's really when people try to get out of an abusive relationship, a marriage, and are dealing with children who are victimized, there needs to be there needs to be an inclusion of the brainwashing in a way that you are not trying to break it down and oppose it, because that won't work
Mm-hmm.
directly. You have to find a way in, right? Because you
Yeah.
want to be an ally.
Yeah.
So I would say that has to be the fundamental intention first, is you are the child's ally, and you're not going to do what the other parent does, which is alienate you. Eventually, when I think the dust settles, you need to inform the children that their parent is mentally ill, that this
Really?
is a mental illness. I do feel that's important when they're equipped and when they're ready
Mm-hmm.
and when they're in their own therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Just as I've worked with children who came from alcoholic family systems, for them to understand the impact of parental alcoholism on their development.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is important for children to understand they're dealing with a personality disordered parent. I've certainly had to do that in my own recovery process.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, that made all the difference for me, right? Because I was trying to humanize someone, my father specifically, but also within my mother and my sister, where there was an absence of humanity. And so that was very detrimental to me. So that actually really helped the scales fall from my eyes and allowed me to embody my truth.
Mm. But do you feel like, because children seem to believe both parents, that it's coming from one parent, that they might just view it as, oh, they just don't like my other parent and I'm going to question.
Yes, that's why it's all about timing. I think it has to be gauged. That's why in the beginning, I think it is important to really try to align with the child. Also, if you're going through litigation, because the court will not take a side typically, no matter how severe the abuse, it is important to figure out what that middle ground is,
Mm-hmm.
so that the best you could do, I think, in these situations in the beginning is have some leverage
Mm-hmm.
so that you're not completely alienated from your child.
Yeah. Yeah. Big topic. So, what about, like, let's say that a survivor is getting out of one of these relationships. We talked a bit about handling the kids and finding common ground. Chris and I often think about what we call universal agreements. Like, what do we both
Mm,
agree on? We care about our kids being healthy and happy and maybe getting a good education, depending on, the background. But
yeah.
but for someone who's, let's say, having their own spirituality weaponized because they're either, again, leaving for something new or just saying, I've had enough of this, any tips for someone getting out, like what they should remember to do or definitely not to do?
With their children, or you mean with themselves, or
With
within the whole?
themselves, I mean, it could be
Yeah,
with their children, even with their ex, knowing that it's going to be a court
I
situation.
see. Yeah. I mean, I think with oneself, one has to, as with complex trauma, you have to reclaim the self that has been diminished by the abuse. So even being able to reconceptualize in the context of spiritual abuse, what does spirituality mean for you?
Hmm.
It doesn't mean submission. It doesn't mean blind obedience. It doesn't mean a loyalty at every cost. Reclaiming your basic humanity, I think, is really the trajectory also to be able to help your children. So it has to begin with your own recovery. It's very complicated because in that reclamation process, people become enraged once the scales fall from your eyes and you begin to see things clearly and access your instinctual aggression. It's very difficult to remain contained. But in order to be able to uh, influence your children in a way that you're not creating, because any kind of oppositional posturing is going to be seen as supply by the narcissists. They love that stuff.
Hmm.
So you want to be kind of gray rocking. You want to be um, neutralized in their eyes. I think in terms of your own healing, that's what you can bring to your children. So you can begin to plant seeds in terms of even as the deists say, the metaphorical word of God is found in nature, it's found in literature, it's found in science. It's found in really being in critical thinking. And you could bring these elements to your children that might oppose the indoctrination of the narcissist, but if you do it tacitly and privately, it will have an influence, an important influence, because at some point, children begin to harness a greater sense of autonomy.
Hmm.
Things are going, especially in adolescence, there is going to be an amplification of symptoms because there is such an internal tension. The hypocrisy is causing somatic symptoms, psychological symptoms, and that begins to bring things more into conscious awareness.
Mm. Yeah, that's good to hold on to because sometimes it feels like no one's going to wake up. Well, Sherri, I think
Yeah.
what you do is so unique because I was going to say, who does someone even go to talk about this? I imagine most therapists
Mhm.
are not aware of religious and spiritual abuse, and most pastors might not be very familiar with narcissistic abuse. So,
Mhm.
how can people find you, or I know you do a lot of writing. Like, tell us where they can go
Mhm.
to learn more.
Okay. I do a lot of writing on my Medium blog. So if you just find my name, Sherri Heller, on Medium, I write pretty extensively about narcissistic abuse and complex trauma. I also have a section about spirituality, and I write about spiritual recovery and things of that nature. And I have a website, sherritherapist.com, that has everything and anything about who I am and the work that I've done. So that's a good place to start.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking all this time to talk about this absolutely fascinating topic. I knew I would learn a number of terms and ideas, and it gives me a lot to think about and also to connect it to a situation in my own life and how to maybe start approaching things differently.
Mm. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Lisa, for creating this platform and having me on. It's been
Oh,
great to be here.
thanks. My pleasure.